Well, hello and welcome to the next installment of the 2021 virtual conference on the value of play. Play is survival. Today, our session is going to be another groundbreaking success. I have confidence. We are so excited to have Dr. Harrison Pinckney, Dr. Treandrea Russworm, Dr. Nathaniel Bryan with us today, and they will be speaking on expanding the conversation on race and play. I first want to take a second to introduce the moderator. My friend and colleague, Dr. Harrison Pinckney, is Assistant Professor of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at Clemson University. He devotes his professional time to examining how to create opportunities for Black youth to experience the freedom and wonderment that defines play. His research focuses on the systems, institutions, and programs that influence the racial socialization of African American youth. Similarly, he examines the way in which racial identity manifests itself in the lives of African American youth. Recognizing the role of faith-based organizations in the African American community, he also explores the ways in which the institution serves youth and the outcomes associated with participation in and with these organizations. Dr. Pinckney is also a steering committee member and active contributor to the Play Coalition, serving as a member of our Play research team, providing expertise as needed, and headlining our Play conference and other partner events, most notably the groundbreaking 2018 keynote on the implications of race and play for youth of color. As he puts it, play consumes much of his time as he is always engaged in fun activities with his 3 sons and wife, whether it's hiking on a sunny day, building a cardboard city on a rainy day, or making up pretend words for bedtime. Play defines much of his life. Harrison, Dr. Pinckney, I am honored to have you with us, and I will let you introduce the rest of your panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for having me to this group. As Stephanie mentioned, 3 years ago, I sat on a panel similar to this one in which colleagues from the field of recreation, park, and tourism studies came together to discuss sort of the realities of what play looks like for Black youth. And in doing that, we took a look at it from a historical perspective. We also talked about some of the contemporary themes that we're noticing within play. And so what we were hoping to do with today's panel is to expand that discussion by digging a little bit deeper, looking for some explanations for why we might experience some of the things that we are witnessing, specifically for Black youth in play, and understanding that these occurrences don't happen at random. And that if we were to take, a few moments, we could find explanations and possible solutions. And so that's what I'm hoping that we'll be able to work on today. So first, we'll start by introducing Dr. Nathaniel Bryan. He is an assistant professor at University of Miami in Ohio. What I appreciate is that he is from education discipline. And so he has been working diligently for years now on this concept of Black play crit, which is rooted in critical race theory. And what his work does more than anything is it helps us to understand for those early school age years, sort of how does, how is play shaped and viewed by others, specifically where Black males are concerned. In addition to Dr. Bryan, we also have Dr. Treandrea Russworm, who's an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst campus. And what I really was fascinated about with Dr. Russworm's work is that she's dealing with slightly older age groups. So you'll see sort of a transition here where Nathaniel will talk for a little bit and then he'll pass it off to Treandrea. He'll talk about the early years and she'll talk about more of those preteen, teenage years. But one of the things that she does that I think is really going to be interesting and hopefully challenge this group today is that she looks at video games and she looks at media and media images. And oftentimes when we have conversations around play, sometimes we tend to want to shy away from video games as almost the antithesis to play. that, play should be unstructured and outside and involve some type of physical movement or physical activity. And through Treandria's work, and hopefully she'll delve a little bit into this today, recognizing that play does change as we get older, and that we have to embrace that and also understand that there are messages even there about race and how our kids begin to be viewed by others. And so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to turn it over to Nathaniel. And what will happen is he'll do a formal presentation for a few moments immediately following. Then we'll have Treandria, she'll share her screen, she'll do a presentation, and then I will lead us in a time of question and answers. And I'll be checking the chat box throughout this time just to sort of fill some of those questions for you all. So Dr. Bryan, I'll turn it over to you.
Dr. Pinckney, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It is indeed a pleasure to be a part of this conversation, this much needed conversation on expanding the conversation of race and play. Just to build on Dr. Pinckney's introduction, I would like to say that my research primarily focuses on the pedagogical and schooling practices of Black male teachers and the schooling and boyhood play experiences of Black boys in early childhood education. I examine both the pedagogical styles and schooling practices and childhood play experiences of Black boys through critical race theory, Black critical theory, and Black male studies. So to that end, germane to the conference's theme, play survival, I would like to share with you a brief presentation titled Centering Black Play Crit in Early Childhood Classrooms. And I will explain later in today's discussion what Black Play Crit is so that you will have a deeper understanding of this conceptualization. I would like to start by sharing two incidents relating to Black boys, two play incidents to be precise. Here you see Bryce Lindley. In 2019, 10-year-old Bryce Lindley was suspended from his elementary school in Detroit, Michigan, and criminal charges were brought against him for assaulting a white classmate who had been inadvertently injured during a playground game of dodgeball. The white boy's mother filed charges because, according to news reports, she was tired of her son being assaulted during play. Though it's really not clear whether Bryce had been previously accused, it is clear that for Bryce, this one incident was the start of what I'm beginning to theorize in my own work as the school playground to prison pipeline. And so I draw on this off-sided school to prison pipeline metaphor to suggest that when Black boys are targeted on school playgrounds for what would normally be considered childlike behaviors, they are often funneled into the juvenile or criminal justice system, which we know irrevocably changes their school and life trajectories as early childhood education. And then we have the story of Isaiah Elliott playing with the toy gun during remote learning. And similarly, a 9-year-old boy, Isaiah Elliott, was suspended from his virtual elementary school during COVID. This incident occurred in New Orleans, Louisiana, where a teacher reported that she saw Isaiah playing with the toy gun in his room. And school administrators and law enforcement officers were contacted to do a supposed wellness check, after which the boy was suspended from school for an undetermined number of days. His family later reported that the gun, in fact, was a toy gun. However, Isaiah, I should say, was punished as if he had or was in possession of a real gun. And so collectively, these play incidents denote what it means to live and play in the afterlife of slavery. And I draw on the work of Saidiya Hartman, who describes the afterlife of slavery as this ongoing degradation of Black life by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. And here in 2021, we're still dealing with this racial calculus and political arithmetic that dehumanizes Black and other minoritized people. It is also, these incidences are also indicative of what scholars are beginning to theorize as spirit murder, or this psychological and physiological trauma associated with being Black in a white supremacist society. And so this begs the question, well, why does spirit murder persist in Black boyhood play? First, we must consider the misperceptions of Black boyhood in general. Most oftentimes, people looking through a white gaze consider Black boys to be unchildlike, to be dangerous, to be up to no good. And then those misperceptions are oftentimes mapped onto Black boys' boyhood play. And we begin, as a result, to mischaracterize the ways in which Black boys play. So Black boys, when they engage in rough and tumble play, are often socially constructed as being far more rough than their white male counterparts. And we also must consider the ways in which teachers are complicit in the spirit murder of Black boys during play. Let's take a look at this video.
There's a new study of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. Researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing: a Black boy, a Black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. Well, here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and Black alike, spent the most time watching the Black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. Researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a Black child, or even a Black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else that's true.
Given the results of this study, we must come to understand that early childhood education is not a safe space for Black and brown children, and particularly Black boys, who are oftentimes entering these spaces with deficit perspectives attached to their bodies. So I wanted, through my work, to interrupt teachers and people in general's perspectives and deficit perspectives of Black boyhood play. So foundational to my conceptualization of Black play crit are 2 extremely important critical theories. And the first theory is Black critical theory, which was introduced to the field of education by Dumas and Ross. And what they argue is that anti-Blackness is endemic to American society and all of its institutions. And what they mean by anti-Blackness is this particular disdain and disgust for Black bodies as reflected in American laws and policies, and even schools and school policies and practices. And building on the notion of Black critical theory is the work of Dr. Tommy Curry. He has introduced what he calls Black male studies. And he, in his conceptualization of Black male study, has given us a very important term that we must use and think about using to describe the experiences of Black boys and men. And Dr. Curry argues that Black men and boys are victims of what he terms anti-Black misandry, this particular disdain and disgust for Black men and boys as reflected in American laws and policies and school policies and practices, I should say. So drawing on both Black critical theory and Black male studies, I introduced what I term Black play crit, which is both a theoretical and pedagogical framework, which purports to interrupt the anti-Black misandric perspectives and anti-Black misandric experiences that Black boys in early childhood education and beyond may face. Black play crit includes 3 developing ideas, and I title them developing ideas because it is my hope and desire that scholars and practitioners build on this conceptualization of Black play crit. So the first developing idea is this idea that play not is endemic to Black boys' play experiences. And by that, I mean that it's important to recognize that through the white gaze, the Black body, the Black boy body is socially constructed as non-human and unchildlike, undeserving of play rights under the white gaze. Such ideas are endemic to Black boyhood play and produce types of anti-Black misandric violence in schools and communities. And this idea of play not is no different than the branding, the racial brandings that many enslaved Africans faced during enslavement. The stereotypes, the deficit perspectives are oftentimes attached to their bodies, thus taking away or stripping them of their ability to be seen as children who have the right to freely play. The second developing idea is this notion of play past, play present, and future nexus. And basically this connects Black boys' play past to their play presents and futures to explain and help us understand the perpetual consequences of race, racism, white supremacy, and anti-Black misandric violence Black boys face during play in schools and community. And so basically Black play past, play present, and future allows us to take a historical gaze. For those of you who may not know that during enslavement, many Black children were not able to freely play. They were working alongside their parents in the fields. However, when Black children were able to play, they were oftentimes playing with white children to learn English so that they can take those linguistic skills back to their parents as a way to work toward freedom. And so in my work, I argue that whereas white children have always had the opportunity to freely play, Black children were playing towards freedom during these unfortunate times in American history. And the last developing idea is the notion of the Black public philosophy of Black boyhood play. And this is basically a pedagogical tool that teachers can use to help develop Black boys' anti-Black misandric consciousness and to challenge deficit perspectives of Black boys during play. So they can use what I call Black play crit literacies, any kind of Black text or posters that can help Black boys to develop this consciousness in the ways in which anti-Blackness oftentimes can inform the play style, people's perceptions of Black boyhood play. So I want to highlight 2 teachers who were my former students who use Black play crit writ large, but specifically the public pedagogy of Black boyhood play to develop the anti-Black misandric consciousness of their students. I would like to introduce you to Mrs. Janae Sneed. She's a 3rd grade teacher at Princeton Elementary School in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so during a literacy lesson, she learned that one of her students, Black male students, enjoyed playing Fortnite. And she had a conversation with him about the game, and she noticed that he was highlighting or addressing a lot of anti-Black misandric themes. So she wanted to help develop his critical consciousness or anti-Blackness and misandric consciousness so that he can be aware of the ways in which video games are not innocent, that they do uphold particular ideologies that need to be interrupted. So she used this pedagogical opportunity to help him develop an anti-Black consciousness, so that when he re-enters these games, he can understand the dangers and the anti-Blackness and deficit perspectives that are often promulgated through these video games. And then there's Ashley Schaffner. She is a kindergarten teacher at Frederick Douglass Elementary School in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so during an integrated math and literacy unit, Ashley also drew on Black play crit and particularly the developing idea of the public philosophy of Black boyhood play to assist her students in identifying and mapping out institutional inequities that relate to access to playgrounds in urban and suburban communities. So the students were able to engage in a community mapping activity where they were able to identify where playgrounds were located. The students discovered that there were limited a number of playgrounds in urban spaces. Therefore, individuals who are from urban backgrounds may lack opportunities to play in safe spaces. So this is how teachers have and are beginning to implement and infuse Black play crit, and particularly the public pedagogy of Black boyhood play, into their curriculum. If you would like to know more about Black Play Crit, I do have a forthcoming book titled Toward a Black Boy Crit Pedagogy, Black Boys, Male Teachers, and Early Childhood Classroom Teachers, where I parse out further the notion of Black Play Crit. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I will pass it off to Triandra.
Okay, sorry about that. This Zoom thing never gets easy. You'd think by now I'd be a veteran at this. So let's try again. Okay, I didn't have myself unmuted, but okay. All right, now hopefully you can hear me and see my slides also. Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a program that I run in Springfield, Massachusetts, and say a little bit about how I came to do this work, given my background in media studies and kind of cultural theory. So I definitely sort of stumbled into this corner of place studies. I am not a traditional place scholar by any means, and I usually only teach at the college level. So most of my background is in media studies and film studies and video game studies. And so these are some of the books that I've written or edited. And it's mostly, for me, it's always been about representation, about analyzing Black art and culture in context. So Blackness is Burning is about the 60s and 70s, popular culture, for example. But, you know, even though that was my first book, I did have one chapter where I was focused on the television show that some of you may remember, Fat Albert, children's programming in the 70s. And so I did a lot of research kind of around audiences during that time and educational television. So I guess I was sort of interested in making the connection or making the leap from like a theoretical analysis of media to a more kind of practitioner-based analysis or context. But as I said, mostly I have been studying and writing about the imagery, popular culture as a set of images, as a set of meanings that we're always navigating, and approaching that from a theoretical standpoint. But recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, I have shifted to kind of combine my interests and training in media studies and video game studies with a more kind of public humanities set of endeavors. So one of those is what I'm going to talk about now, which is a program that I created called Radical Play. And part of what was guiding me in working in creating this program and working with Black and Latinx youth in Springfield is this need for taking our humanities-based research, which is again often theoretical, and making sure that it is digestible and applicable to people's lives, right? As humanists, that's what we care about, but it isn't always the case that we have a practitioner kind of focus. So this sort of statement, I think, resonates with my attempts to bridge STEM fields, the arts, and media studies in a way, sort of bring these things into greater, a sort of broader fusion or a stronger fusion. So as I've been thinking about it, we have this urgent need for a broad public humanities programs that combine critical thinking, which is again what we're good at in English departments. We're good at this in the media studies, literary studies side of our campuses. So the critical thinking and analysis with the cultivation of technical and civic literacies. So that was something that all of my work in video games was starting that's where all that work was sort of starting to lead in analyzing games as culture, as related to film and media, but also as distinct. It started to become more clear to me that video games are doing important work, sometimes very sort of disruptive and problematic work culturally, but also work that it can be built upon, work that can be generative. So let's think for a moment about why study video games, and perhaps why in this context, in a sort of public humanities kind of sort of public facing format. Well, we know that, just as Dr. Bryan was explaining, that Black youth who have had their public and outdoor play actively policed from the earliest of ages, we know that they're also playing video games in large numbers. Black, Latinx youth, American households in general, more than 60% report playing video games daily, which is a high number. That's a large amount of people who are regularly playing video games. But we know that Black and Latinx youth particularly play games in high numbers. And sometimes this is private play, kind of one-on-one solitary play, but more often than not, this is social play, this is online play, and people play games like, if we're thinking about youth, a game like Minecraft is popular, but so are other games like Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto. These are games that you may have heard from, or you might have these children or teenagers in your life who are playing these games. And so I would say that not all video games invite play. Playing a game is not always like the kind of play that we think of when we say play is about survival or play for life. Video games as computational artifacts have a lot of things going on, but it's not always these things, stimulating creativity, stimulating the imagination, exploration, self-exploration, or even creating technical literacies. But sometimes it is, right? At their best, video game play, and a game like Minecraft is a great example because it does invite some of this more freer play, right? That you're not restricted by a story. You have to use these sort of virtual tools to create, and people have done sort of spectacular and unexpected things in a game like Minecraft. So I would say at their best, video games, when they're functioning as play, can lead to many of the things that we would associate with other forms of play. At their worst, however, as Dr. Bryan was also indicating in one of his examples, games are heavily tied to anti-Black rhetoric, anti-Black ideologies, and white supremacy. So at their worst, games reinscribe power structures and ideologies like white supremacy. And then we know that games are always teaching, they're always indoctrinating. So military shooters like Call of Duty, for example, are conditioning from a very early age, from the earliest moments that people are aware of these games, even Fortnite is also a shooter. It's a battle royale kind of shooter. Those types of games are always conditioning a positive affiliation and tolerance for all of these symbols of patriotism, of military might, of excessive force even. So we know that games are teaching unmediated. Games are indoctrinating tools, right? They can be some of the other things that I mentioned, like creativity, stimulating the imagination, but they're often always also reinscribing these power structures and ideologies. So one example is the game Skyrim, which those other images were from, which is a fantasy game. It's a role-playing fantasy game. And in just looking at these images here, these are some of the characters that are non-human characters that you can play, the races of beings that you can be. And the non-human characters in a game like Skyrim are typically coded as monstrous. But if you look at the top corner there, the character that has cornrows, that character is called a red guard. And the red guards are optically speaking, coded as black. They are the characters that most likely resemble, most closely resemble African Americans. And part of what we look at when we study a game like Skyrim is how these characters are described by the game, and also in terms of their attributes and special skills that they have, as having these natural physical abilities, as being strong, right? Not necessarily smart, not great at making certain kinds of items, not great at crafting, as some of the other races are, not agile necessarily, but sturdy and strong and impervious to certain kinds of pain, like fire. So, we can see right off the bat there, right at the surface, how anti-Blackness and the sort of racism can be hardwired into the characterizations. So we would say that representation, studying and understanding representation, is important when it comes to film and television, and also when it comes to games, perhaps even more so these days that so many people have games as a part of their lives, right? This is a sort of cultural phenomenon that is larger in terms of revenue than film, television, and music, right? All of those industries generate significantly less money each year than the video games industries do. And so when we look at a game like Skyrim and we see these stereotypes and these racist ideologies that are hardwired into the game, that's sort of one reason, I think one motivation for making a kind of civic sort of literacy more a part of our agenda, right? Or more a part of how we study and think about play and how we think about these different audiences throughout these developmental milestones. Again, even games like popular games like Madden, or this is NBA 2K. This was the latest iteration with Kobe Bryant on the cover. We know again that Black and Latinx communities and youth from 18 to 30, but even younger than that, play these games in large number, and they play like yearly installments of these games. But even a game like NBA 2K, as I've written before, has its own biases and anti-Black codes hardwired into a game that you might think has a more sort of celebratory or a more sort of positive association to Blackness. It doesn't, right? It doesn't, and it has a sort of long history of using these problematic codes and these tools of adaptation to, again, kind of promote these problematic discourses and problematic views, both in the story mode and in the sort of free-ranging simulation modes. So with all of this in mind and kind of thinking about games and play and sort of representation and how that relates to games, I created the Radical Play Institute in 2016. And it's been a slow start, but it's definitely picked up. And it started by working with students at a local junior high school in Springfield. And it's kind of evolved to mostly working with students that are in high school. But I would describe the four sort of tenets or the four pillars of radical play as this. This is what we focus on in the program, which often runs for a semester. We're looking to scale it up. I'm looking to scale it up to be a like summer bridge program. Again, that interest in wanting to bridge STEM fields and technical histories as well with the sort of arts and culture side of things still there for me. But the tenets are helping students use games to investigate things like self-consciousness. So that means, who are we and why do we play? Having students become very aware by establishing their own play histories and how that relates to games. And usually in this program, I get avid gamers, both girls and boys, but usually boys who are self-described avid gamers. So we get them to think about, who are they? What do they value? What do they play? Sort of broadening their consciousness and their self-awareness. And then we introduce that criticality part, which as a scholar, I'm good at, and thinking about how we can understand those games. So being able to do an analysis of the video games, so helping them learn how to read games as culture, read games as art, read games as systems that are ideological systems, right? So how can we better understand the games? How can we better understand the world around us through our engagement with games? And then we use the hashtag #PlayWoke, or so we sort of use that as a way to kind of describe what we're doing. Creativity. So we don't want students to only think of themselves as consumers of games and as players of games. We want them to be even more aware about what they're bringing to the table as they navigate these codes and systems. They're always negotiating and trying to place themselves, their imagination, their values, etc., in these worlds. So we always have the students create something, whether it's a template for a game, a small scale game itself, or other kinds of media. So how can we stimulate creativity around students' love for and critical readings and understandings of themselves and of games? And then finally, we also like to have a kind of a community-centered approach to what all of this work that's being done, and thinking about connections and community. So there we think about, how can we use video games and digital culture, because we also see ourselves as helping shape and create digital citizens, better digital citizens. How can we use all of this to create and imagine a better world around us? How can we change our local environments? How can we be involved locally in ways that are significant? So taking that inspiration, that love, that energy for games, and using it and channeling it in a multitude of directions that directly impact our communities. So those are the pillars of the program. And I think I have a couple of examples of what this looks like. So quite often what we do is we do a lot of what I call conceptual game design. So that is making a pitch, coming up with an idea for a video game that is replacing maybe your favorite game that you play now. What would make that game better? This is a part of that critical and creative work. What would make your favorite game better? And what would make it sort of more relevant to your local community and to who you are? So students come up with some amazing ideas. For example, one year they created a prototype for a Black Lives Matter baseball game. It was going to be like a historical baseball game, so like a baseball simulation, but it would have this story. It was centered around Jackie Robinson and sort of reimagining and retelling his past, but focusing on the acts of racism and systemic violence that were also a part of that time, and using all of this to create this sort of beautiful, I think it was a black and white. They imagined this whole game being played in black and white. So they're using their imaginations and their experience with games to try to change the industry. And some of the kids, hopefully, and the program hasn't been around for that long, but some of the kids hopefully will go on to want to make games and to formally enter programs that will help them make games. But even if they don't, I think those creative exercises really empower them and help them think about their agency more. So I'll give you another example of a different type of project that we create. And this one was just a sort of digital media project where we used games. It's called Machinima, where you use game footage to repurpose it and tell different stories. And in this case, we did a series of interviews over some of the images. And some of these are violent images because it's from Grand Theft Auto was sort of the basis of that game. But if you listen to what the students are saying, what they're sort of dreaming about and talking about, I think it makes for a kind of interesting juxtaposition against the images. So some of it's kind of consistent with what they're saying, but we try to do that, pair conversations, ideas, storytelling with what already exists in games to create this sort of disjuncture. So I'll show you an example of what I mean here in a short clip. Tell me about something that you would change in the world around us, in our society, in our communities. You know, what do you see as something that should be addressed?
Violence with guns on Black people and on students with like school shootings going on.
Here's what we know at this hour. At least 17 people have been killed, students and adults. At least 15 injured, and the shooter, 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz, is in custody. This is the 18th school shooting already this year. It is just mid-February. Our full team is here this morning. We're going to hear from...
What do you think we can do? If you're a legislator, if you're going to be persuasive, convince American society, what needs to happen to change this trend in school shootings, kids being killed on campus? What would you say? What do you think needs to happen?
Well, first we need to decide what, like, figure out like why exactly schools are being shot up, and if it's maybe because of some students and their mental disability, then we could find a way to help them before they react in a negative way.
We have a way of just ignoring this, of just saying these kids are bad seeds or they're just very sick, when in reality, these are our children. These are the kids that are our sons and daughters, but just as importantly, they sit next to our sons and daughters in classes around the world.
Something in the world I would like to change is mental health, what people think about it, or how it's... I know people who have a mental health are scared because they think, some people think it's an excuse to just stay home and cry or something. Mm-hmm. Or some people are just scared to talk about it because they know no one else will understand.
Video games are political because they show real events that happens in the real world, a way to get through people who love playing games. Something that changed my life is violence, a fear of having fun.
So I'll stop there, but what you can see in that video is a couple of different things being matched together. So it ends up being a digital media project that includes video game footage, that's the machinima part, so game footage that's repurposed for other purposes, but you also saw news clips spliced in between. You also saw the smoke that was that sort of custom animation that they helped make, where you saw the green smoke and the purple smoke, so they were playing around with Adobe After Effects. So a project like that, we believe, helps students tap into a variety of different skill sets, and we always work in teams. So in that case, we did some interviews with the students, but then the students worked together to kind of create their vision for what they wanted their sort of final digital project to be. So sometimes we do things like this as well. I'll move on now and just kind of get at another reason why I think video games are so crucial to thinking about youth and play, but even adult play. So beyond the ages that we might typically study when we think about play and play studies, you know, sort of from early childhood all the way through high school, you know, part of my argument is that we have to keep thinking about play and play theory and play studies as they relate to BIPOC students and people of color kind of indefinitely, because something like video games sticks around. You know, the average age of your video game player for a long time had been 32. That was the average age. But that number is always getting older and older as people tend to, if they firmly identify as gamers, tend to not stop playing. I'm in my 40s, I'm middle-aged. middle-aged, and I would also probably identify as a gamer, and I don't really see a time when I'm not going to be playing games in some way, shape, or form, mainstream games, independent games, etc. So I think there's an argument here for using games to kind of study really a lifespan of play for people that identify as gamers and have played them early on, all the way through adulthood, and elderly populations now, or is a growing segment in video game players. But the one final reason that I'll share about why I think this work is important is because the more video games I play, and I would seem to not be the demographic to have white supremacist groups, recruiting groups, reach out to me. I would seem to probably be everything about my digital profile as a middle-aged queer Black woman would indicate that I'm not the audience for this. But the more video games I play, the more YouTube videos I watch, the more Twitch streams I watch of video game play, the more recruiting I get from not only conservative sort of think tanks and entities that are raising money during the election, during the most recent election, for example. I got a flood of this information on all of the platforms, across all of the platforms. So I think that there's some work there to do in thinking about why white supremacist marketing and recruiting, which we already know is so closely connected to video games, how that reaches our young communities of color, our young Black, Latinx players of color, high school, junior high school students, and older, who are also getting this messaging on top of the images and the messaging in a game like Call of Duty. So in the foreground picture there, you see Donald Trump and Lil Wayne. So why does someone like Donald Trump pardon Lil Wayne, right? Because that signals to a certain audience, a certain demographic, potentially that they're down, right? That Trump is down with Lil Wayne, therefore it can't be that bad, right? That whatever Trump symbolizes can't be that bad and might in fact be good for these communities. So there is a connection between this type of play, playing Minecraft, playing The Sims, playing Call of Duty, playing NBA 2K, and this direct messaging and marketing. And so that's partly why I think that there's an urgency around doing this work and around connecting how we read culture, how we understand, how we digest and deconstruct culture, and reaching publics who need that information, who may or may not ever attend college, for example, right? So my college students get healthy doses of this, these ways of thinking and this education as a part of their focus in these fields. But we do have a good number of people who play video games who will never go to study video games in college, right? They will never ever be thinking about games in a critical way, in ways that can kind of deconstruct and unveil these ideologies that are right at their core, and still they'll be marketed in these ways. They'll be recruited and marketed in these ways because of their play practices. So finally, I would say that another core piece of all of this for me has been thinking about the relevancy and the use of science fiction, of Afrofuturism and futurity, and speculative game design, right? Combining all of these things together. So the work of Octavia Butler, for example, being able to critically understand dystopias. A lot of video games are dystopian, they're post-apocalyptic, and I think it naturalizes the dystopian frame for us, playing games so often. So being able to read an imperative for change that is also a part of those traditions that a lot of kids don't ever know, even though a lot of the read is also kind of in a similar vein. So we also build on critical tools like speculative game design, imagining other worlds, so that by proxy and analogy, we can think of our own world and what needs to change and how to go about that. So the final critical term I'll leave us with is the idea of a critical utopia. And utopia is not as appealing these days as dystopia. Everybody can kind of acknowledge that we are in a global pandemic. We're living in a dystopia. We were definitely living in a dystopia before this moment. But something like utopia is elusive because it's something that we haven't known. But I argue, and we use a program like Radical Play to also argue, that we need to understand utopia. We need to point our compasses, our creative imagination, our creative and critical energy energy toward utopia as a vision of meeting these chronically unmet desires. Utopia is never paradise. It's just a better place than what we have now. So I guess I'll end there and say that I am hopeful about what video games can do, but not on their own. They need to be packaged with a complete set of skills to be able to decode, navigate, and mediate them. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Andrea. That wow. So I'll wait for Nathaniel to turn on his camera as well. Thank you. And so what we're going to do is we're going to open it up for questions. Please type your questions into the chat box, as well as any comments. I have more comments for you all than questions. But one of the things that we'll start with is this year's theme is player survival. But Nathaniel, it seems that from some of the discussion, some of your talking points, that almost at the very survival of Black male youth, in particular Black boys, is threatened in these spaces of play. What is your thought when you consider, first off, did I interpret that, accurately? And if so, what is your thoughts when you see that the theme is player survival, but understanding what that might, how that plays out for Black boys?
Yes, your interpretation is spot on, actually. Anytime that Black children or BIPOC children exist in a white supremacist state, there's really, and I may get some pushback for saying this, there's oftentimes no such thing as survival, right? Because at any moment, Black bodies, and we've seen this, particularly with the case of Tamir Rice, at any place, Black bodies, and particularly Black male bodies, can be misread, and particularly in spaces that we would consider to be safe. And so there's no such thing as surviving, in a white supremacist state, And I love the theme for this year. Play is survival, but we have to go deeper in our criticality by asking, play is survival for whom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so you talk about this idea that these spaces should be safe, and one of the notes that I had was you mentioned Tamir Rice. I also think about really what jump-started this conversation, 3-4 years ago now, when I expressed some frustration, and the director of the Play Coalition, Stephanie Garst, she and I began to talk about bringing that, some of that discussion to the Play conference, and so in expressing frustration, I was highlighting this story from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the 4 boys that were, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, and when they were walking home from the Kroc Center, pulled over by the police at gunpoint, committed no crime, just, and there was no viable explanation being offered for, why the police pulled them over. And so the response from those kids was to stay home, right? So after that, they stopped engaging in a lot of public spaces. They mostly played in their yards or were online. But then we hear the work that Andrea, that you're engaged in, then we start to understand that virtual space may not necessarily be safe for Black youth either. Is that accurate, or can we talk a little bit about that? About where can we find a safe space, play space for our kids if we're seeing these challenges, in physical spaces as well as virtual or digital spaces?
Yeah, so I guess when I think about the theme play is survival, part of me wants to right away say, ironically, unfortunately, tragically, digital play might be the safest place for BIPOC youth. it's the safest place, maybe in a physical sense, maybe, but it's certainly not the safest place in an ontological sense, in a psychological sense. If what you're constantly navigating are years and years and years of these destructive, often anti-Black, white supremacist images that are part of your gameplay, right? Where you can, rarely ever, if ever, play a central character in a game who is Black or who is Indigenous or who is Latinx, right? You don't get to see that kind of representation featured in mainstream games very often. And if you do, especially with all ethnicities and races that are not white, you see them as criminalized, or it's very stereotypically kind of rendered. So in the one sense, yeah, you could say, well, physically, you know where your child is if they're home and they're playing in their bedroom and they're on their headset and they're talking to their friends. They might be physically safe, but the stream of images and imagery that they're constantly navigating certainly puts that into doubt, right? That they are actually safe. But I would say that, yeah, so I think there's just work to do on all sides and sort of raising public awareness around this. And it might depend, on what kind of games people are playing. Like I said, I think people like Minecraft a lot for thinking about school and teaching coding, for example. There are lots of Minecraft camps. But then immediately you might use Minecraft as a game that could get your young child interested in STEM fields. But the minute they start to formalize that education, they're going to run into those systemic barriers that are still a part of, what we all know exists, right? So being in a STEM program, for example, or even being in one of these code camps as one of the, if not the only, BIPOC student, you're going to right away deal with that stream of biases. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying no, none of the spaces are safe, even though they just come with their own maybe unique challenges, but there's still some commonalities in what makes play for BIPOC kids and BIPOC people dangerous. It's a transgression to play. To play is transgressive, but it also is a precarious activity.
Right. Now, to be clear, and although I'm the moderator, Nathaniel, if you have a direct response or question for Triandria or vice versa, please, jump in. We're just sort of sitting on the couch having a discussion here. But to be clear, Triandria, even though you used video games as your context for today's discussion, you look at other forms of media, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
And I think where I'm sort of leading with that, before I don't want to misspeak, but I'm thinking about that study that was mentioned in the video that you shared, Nathaniel, where the teachers who were presented with sort of this background understanding of hey, this particular student, their parent is in and out of the home. But even there, that we saw that first off, the teachers tended to show empathy towards the students that were of their own race. But then there was a second piece to that, which was that when in that study, or in a different study in that video, when they were looking for those behaviors, you saw that all of the teachers were more closely watching the Black boys in particular. And I think that that's important because it appears to me that it connects directly with some of Triandria's work, in the sense of where are these perceptions, stemming from, right? Where is it this perception that even as a Black male, I can be a teacher, but I still come to the classroom as a Black male and still keep my eye more closely on Black male students. So could you respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really great observation. And I think it's important to note that Black people, brown people, we all live under a white supremacist structure. So at any point, we're internalizing anti-Blackness. So it plays itself out in terms of the ways in which we view Black boys play, because we've been carefully taught, to be honest, to hate ourselves. So I think programs like Radical Play and my conceptualization of Black play crit will help push back against experience that internalization that we're all at any point can be a part of, you know? And so when you think about teachers as well, you have to understand that most teachers attend the same pre-service teacher education where books of biases and stereotypes of Black boys are used, right? And so again, there's this internalization which causes teachers, when they enter into classroom spaces, to carry out and to promulgate the anti-Blackness and the anti-Black misandry that exists in every institutional space in our society.
So, okay. So in looking at that, one of the things that I really appreciated in both of your talks, yes, okay. So Daphne, I see your question, and your question is actually headed right in the direction that I was going to take us. So in both of your talks, I appreciated that you gave some tangible examples where you were to take, where you were able to take your theoretical ideas and place them into, real time, context. And so, Nathaniel, I was especially appreciative that when you talked about your work with your former students, that you were also able to highlight actually, so it's not just, only Black teachers are able to, take this approach towards fighting against these ideas of anti-Blackness and how we're perceiving our students. And so, to Daphne's question, do you have other suggestions for how you can continue to introduce Black Play Crit, to those pre-service teachers? And Triandra, I want you to think of it in a similar sense, because I saw that where Nathaniel was empowering the teachers, because that's his audience, you were empowering the youth. And so I want us to think, if you can answer that as well, Nathaniel specifically within the context of those pre-service teachers, but Triandra, most of the audience for, the Play Conference is so diverse. So we have some people who are researchers, but we have a lot of people who are, on the ground in the trenches, leading play movements in their local communities. So thinking about other tangible ways that we could engage these conversations. So I'll start with you, Nathaniel, and then I'll come over to you, Triandra.
Right, I think particularly in pre-service teacher education programs, I know at the undergraduate level, there is always a requirement for students to take play theory courses. And in those courses, pre-service teacher educators tend to rely and over-rely on play theories and research studies that prioritize white cultural ways of knowing and being. So I think the first place to start is to really rethink, fundamentally rethink your play theory courses. Center the play experiences of Black and Brown children. I know there's a small but growing body of research on BIPOC children's play. We have to prioritize those research studies in order to push back against the whiteification of childhood play. We have to ask who play experience matters in our play theory courses, and ensure that we are doing much to center the play experiences of historically marginalized populations.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So for me, I would say that, the good news is that there's a huge intersection between video game studies from like the media study side and education. Like education, more broadly construed, has used video games as research in a lot of different capacities. And in fact, you'll see one of the trends is gamification, is sort of using games to kind of help teach skills like math or geography. So there's already a good deal of research out there that I think teachers could use to have at their disposal. That research does not necessarily get at some of these racial logics that we're talking about here as part of this conversation. So in the chat, I'm going to put some titles of books that I think if you're a teacher and you want to open up your classroom to thinking about games or thinking about how students use games in their lives as a strategy, as a pedagogical strategy, then I would say take a look at some of these sources, but also your example, Nathaniel, you used an example of the teacher who was using Fortnite, to sort of get at and have these discussions about anti-Blackness, with the students. That's it. The buy-in, I think the entry point is always going to be your students, what your students are playing. If you have a moment where they're able to talk about, what they did this summer or what they do for fun, I'm sure games are going to come up very quickly in the conversation. So you can even have fun with it and do a little poll of, what are the hot games right now? What games are you all playing? What do you really love the most? Among Us is a lot of the free to play games are going to be popular for obvious reasons because they're free to play. You just download them. You can play them on your tablet, on your iPhone, on your PlayStation, whatever. Those games tend to be even more problematic because of their pay structure. Nothing is free, right? So again, you're going to get more advertising, more sort of privacy issues that is going to relate to the free to play games. And then it's going to link to this larger digital portfolio or digital persona of your students, right? So all of this information, all of this data is even more kind of compromised and available to the creators of the developers and the distributors of these free-to-play games. But anyhow, use that as an entry point, as a way to start to have some of these conversations, and then maybe check out some of these sources. I really recommend, I put my own book there, but a book that is not mine that I really recommend that is even more digestible and kind of just user-friendly in terms of reading is How to Play Video Games. They're very, very short chapters on concepts like race. I did write the chapter on race in that book, but on like narrative and world building. So you can kind of take a theme on feminism and, you could take a theme or an issue and read that chapter and pair it with a game that your kids are playing. I think that's like a very practical first step in having conversations that are broader than just, hey, we love the game because it's fun. Because you're going to get a lot of your students saying that is we're just relaxing, we're just having fun. I used to get in my classes a lot of times like, don't think too deeply about this. It's just fun, but you can use that enthusiasm for their game and wanting to use it as fun to get to some of these deeper discussions and issues and helping them see what may be going on in their favorite game. And it's not to help to make them stop playing the game. I always feel like that's never my never my motive. It's to be a more critical player when you are playing it and realize, what you're negotiating and the work that you're constantly doing as you play these games.
Just to build on something that you said earlier, I think we need to consider whose work, again, we're prioritizing in our courses, particularly in pre-service teacher education courses. And I know my work focuses largely on Black boys, but there are tons of research studies on Black girls play. For example, Kyra Gaunt's work, although she's an ethnomusicologist, her work really gives us a different view of the ways in which Black girls play that can perhaps challenge our stereotypical and biased views of Black girls play.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great source. Kyra's work.
So very good. So I think I'm gonna watch and see if anything else pops up in the.
Ooh, some other
So
sources.
thank you for another source. And I know that on Mondays past few weeks that the Play Conference has been hosting Black Girl Magic Mondays, and so they've been delving into some of those conversations, and I think that we are probably complementing very well, at this point in the conversation, some of what those presenters have been discussing. So thank you for that. I want to ask as we get ready to wrap up, because I'm not seeing any other questions yet. I think, Treandra, you've already provided what you thought was a good first step. But Nathaniel, again, thinking about who our audience is, not necessarily all teachers, not necessarily all people who are in the academy, but people who are really committed to play. And those who are on here now and then those who watch this at a later point, all have some level of commitment to understanding how do we create. I think we've moved past this idea of equity in play to actually talking about safety in play, right? Safety specifically um, for youth who are more likely to experience violence and harassment or depictions of violence when we talk about virtual spaces. So, are there any other closing thoughts or first steps that you would recommend that we consider for our colleagues as they delve more into this, wanting to address this issue?
I think before we move forward and rethinking the play experiences of BIPOC children, I think we have to start with unlearning, right? And we have to engage in this archaeology of the self, right? To deal with those biases and stereotypes that we may bring to institutional spaces that cause us to engage in stereotypical practices of children's play. It has to start with knowing yourself and challenging yourself to rethink your biases and stereotypes. And unless we do that, unless we start there, there's no forward motion.
Yeah.
Treandrea, anything else you want to add there?
I think that I would say that my hope would be that video games has sort of become this medium that it didn't happen overnight, but like I said, it's become the sort of most lucrative, most commercially kind of successful of the mass media mediums. And so I think that we have to contend with it. I would say that as educators, as parents, as aunts and uncles, there are lots of ways to kind of enter the conversation and take games seriously. And so my kind of parting advice is to try to find ways to do that, even if you really hate them and you really can't be bothered. Maybe sit down with a child in your life, or again have those conversations with your students, because all of these things that we know are important about play do show up in how people engage video games. But as a media institution, as a form of media, a lot of the other stuff shows up as well. So I think that they can be an important kind of litmus test, an important kind of case study, and an important kind of invitation to do good work, to do work that is self-reflexive, that is sort of socially progressive and socially responsible, and that is also forward-thinking. Because we have just sort of legions of people that are raised on this art form. And so if we want to see changes in what our media landscapes look like, I think we do well to pay more attention to who's playing, and then of course who's creating this work. So I guess that's my advice is even if games are not your thing and you don't play them, maybe try to find some small ways to be aware of them and take them seriously. I think the children in your lives, in your classes, and in your families will be grateful for that someone wants to talk to them about what they're playing.
Thank you. And so I know Stephanie will hop on here in a moment, but I think, as I was listening, again, having attended multiple play conferences in the past, having presented, I know that we are engaging in a conversation that we typically don't, have in this particular space. And so I want to thank you all for sort of opening up the conversation a little bit more. And I think Nathaniel said it a little bit earlier, I just want to reiterate that as we think about the theme of play of survival, recognizing that for some, unfortunately, for some, play is survival while others are trying to survive while playing, and that's a very challenging and sobering idea that I think we need to keep in mind. So I'll stop there and we'll turn it back over to Stephanie and let her wrap us up.
I was ready to talk, and then you had to go out and say others are trying to survive while playing, and I had to write that down. And so, wow, okay. So you just continue to open my eyes. I appreciate that. So with that, I want to say to Dr. Pinckney and Dr. Westworm, excuse me, and Dr. Brian, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Grateful to you, Harrison, again, for bringing another great cadre of scholars together to expand this conversation that you and many began several years ago. As he mentioned, this has been a great complement to the Black Girl Magic Monday series with Dr. Outley that picks back up in 2 weeks with Dr. Sharon McKenzie, who I believe was on here with us today, along with several of the previous speakers. And with today's session, I just appreciated the resources and the concrete examples that each of you shared that was mentioned before to challenge our stereotypical ideas and biases and framework, especially needing to be mindful of whose play we are referencing. Just really wonderful points to hit home when we think about who we're including, who we're talking about when we're doing this work, this research, this teaching, this play in our communities. So just thank you for all of that. We've recorded this session so that those that can be with us today could see it, or if you're like me, you might have to just go back and listen again to take some more notes, because I can only write so fast. But I appreciate you all for sharing your voice today, and look forward to continuing this conversation.